Hey folks, this is going to be a video about the majority of the terms that we're going to need to know to talk about Renaissance poetry for this unit. And these terms are going to also apply to Shakespeare when we get to that. So what I want to do first is I'm just going to go through some terms that are familiar to you. Some of this stuff may be review from previous years or from earlier in this class, but I want to make sure that we're on a level playing field so that everybody has access to all of the terms and all of the definitions. Then I will attach this document in the module as well, so you can access the actual Word document of the terms. So let me go through. First few poems we're going to read in this unit are going to be sonnets. The sonnet was the most popular poetic form during the Renaissance, especially in England. We've talked about Renaissance history and that kind of stuff, so you should be able to sort of place this idea of a rebirth of Greek and Roman culture, and that the sonnet came up from Florence, Italy, where a guy named Petrarch invented it. The definition of a sonnet is pretty straightforward. It's a 14-line poem, always 14, can't be 15, can't be 13, has to be 14, written in iambic pentameter. We can talk more about iambic pentameter in a second, but what you need to know about iambic pentameter is that the lines are 10 syllables long. And actually, one of the interesting things about a sonnet is the combination of it being 14 lines and each line being 10 syllables tends to make them look square on the page. So if it's 14 lines long and it looks like a box, it's probably a sonnet. But you can count the syllables in the line to know whether it's got 10 syllables or not. With an intricate rhyme scheme, we'll talk about rhyme scheme in a second, but usually a sonnet is composed of various rhyme scheme elements. An 8-line grouping and a 6-line grouping, that adds up to 14. 3 4-line groupings and a 2-line grouping, that adds up to 14. So it's some combination of rhyming line groupings that add up to 14 lines. And we can figure that out when we look at the rhyme scheme. And a sonnet is usually about love in some way, shape, or form. Now, that rule was 100% solid in the Renaissance times. Every Renaissance sonnet that you run into is going to be about love in some way, shape, or form. That rule has been bent and broken as time goes on. So we'll read some sonnets, from the Romantic period that are about nature or that are about power or things of that nature. And then people have written sort of hate sonnets and stuff like that. And so they've intentionally broken the rules or stretched the definition of a sonnet as time has gone on. They use the form without necessarily the love bit. But you should know that originally sonnets were written about love. In fact, the first sonnets written by this guy named Petrarch and also by Dante, you might recognize him from Dante's Inferno, they were essentially the original creeper poems. These guys found this perfect idealized beauty that they fell in love with, and they wrote poems about how perfect she was, but they never talked to her themselves. They wrote from a distance, and so it was like a creeper poem, like I'm going to find some girl and I'm going to write, I don't know, 50 or more poems in this form addressed to her, but I'm never going to talk to her, and we're never going to get to know each other. I'll just creep on her from a distance and write poems. It's weird from our perspective, but remember, this comes out of that medieval idealized love tradition, love for love's sake, and some of the kinds of things that we saw in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and chivalry and that kind of thing. So, all right, let's look at some of the elements of this. Iambic pentameter. As I said, iambic pentameter is a 10-syllable long line that's composed of pairings of stressed and unstressed syllables in combination. I'm not going to make you learn meter because it's a difficult thing to learn. But an iamb is a particular combination of stressed and unstressed syllables, and it's a 2-syllable grouping, and it's a pentameter. Penta is like pentagon, pentagram. It's 5, so it's 5 groupings of these 2-syllable words, which ends up with a 10-syllable line. Meter is what gives things sort of the rhythm that they have as you say them out loud. And there's lots of different meters out there, like the Iliad and the Odyssey were written in dactylic hexameter. I think that Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven is written in trochaic octameter, but there's lots of different meters out there, and I'm not going to ask you to memorize or learn them, but iambic pentameter is enormously famous. basically because of Shakespeare, but also because of sonnets. Shakespeare writes his plays a lot of times in iambic pentameter, and the sonnets are written in iambic pentameter. But it's probably the easiest meter to write in English because of the rhythms of English speech. They most naturally fit pentameter, and so whatever. All right, end rhyme. End rhyme is when words at the ends of lines rhyme with each other in a repeating pattern. Now, we started out way back in the Anglo-Saxon period when poems didn't use rhyme. They used what's called alliteration, an alliterative verse. They counted the number of alliterations per line instead of using end rhyme. But end rhymes are a traditional way of poetry. We know it's a poem when we open up a Hallmark card and the ends of lines rhyme with each other, or when we read Dr. Seuss and the ends of lines rhyme with each other. However, end rhyme can be enormously variable and enormously complex. And what you need to know is the rhyme scheme. So how to define a rhyme scheme of a poem is every time there's a new word, you want to look and see if it rhymes with a previous word. If it does, then it's part of a rhyme scheme. If it doesn't, then it's a new rhyme. So like your first word at the end of a line is A. That's how you mark it in the rhyme scheme. And then you look at the second word at the end of the line. If it rhymes with the first one, it's also A. If it doesn't, it's B. Then you look at the third last word of the third line, and if it rhymes with the first word, it's A. If it rhymes with the second word, it's B. If it doesn't rhyme with either of them, it's C. And so you can sort of do the rhyme scheme that way. Now, when we're dealing with sonnets, remember that sonnets add up to 14 lines. And so sonnets are usually composed of rhyming elements. The easiest one that you can find is a couplet, which is a pair of rhyming lines. A, B, B, C, C. We saw this in Chaucer. The Canterbury Tales was written primarily in couplets. Then we have quatrains, which is a 4-line rhyming group, 4 lines that share a rhyme scheme. Some options: A, B, A, B, A, B, C, D, A, B, B, A. Any combination. There's more than that. In fact, the more lines you have, the more numbers of combinations there are. But if it's a 4-line rhyming group that has a rhyme scheme like that, we call it a quatrain. We saw those in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight when it would break into rhyming quatrains. So that's pretty straightforward. The two new ones that you haven't had any experience with before are what's called sestet and octave. Sestet is 6 lines that share a rhyme scheme, and there's lots of different combinations. A couple of easy ones would be A, B, A, B, A, B. See how that's 6 lines and they share a rhyme scheme? Another one would be ABC, ABC. That would share a rhyme scheme. So that would be an example of a sestet. An octave is even more complex. That's 8 lines that share a rhyme scheme, like ABBA, ABBA. And there's a zillion options for how to make octaves. But you should just be able to count the number of lines in a rhyming part of a poem and identify whether it's a couplet, quatrain, sestet, or octave. And they're all going to add up in different ways to get 14 lines. And you can see how they might. For example, you might have 2 quatrains and a sestet. Or you might have an octave, a quatrain, and a couplet. 8 and 4 is 12, and 2 is 14. So some combination of those various rhyming elements is going to make the complex rhyme scheme of a sonnet. And you should be able to put the A's and the B's along the right-hand side of the sonnet and identify what you're looking at. All right. So next we have the types of sonnets. There's 3 that I want you to know that are pretty famous. And these are the rhyme schemes. Petrarch, like I said, is the guy who invented the sonnet. And his famous rhyme schemes are what's called Petrarchan sonnet rhyme schemes. And there's 2 of them, and they're nearly identical. A Petrarchan sonnet is ABBA, ABBA, that's an octave. CDE, CDE, and that's a sestet. Petrarchan sonnets are always an octave and a sestet. What's fun about the rhyme schemes of the sonnets, and one of the reasons you want to pay attention to the rhyme schemes is because, generally speaking, they help you understand the meaning of the sonnet. The first octave, the first rhyming group that's all together, is going to be about one topic. And then the sestet, which comes at the end, is going to almost be a reply or a commentary on the first bit. And so you're going to have 2 units of meaning. The octave is 1 unit of meaning, and the sestet is the next. And then, another way that Petrarch sometimes did them was ABBA, ABBA, and then his sestet would be CD, CD, CD instead of CDE, CDE. And it doesn't really matter. Like, it's just a way to identify the rhyme scheme. The same thing would be true where the octave would be about one thing and the sestet would be about something else. In English, it's much harder to rhyme than it is in Italian. So you see more complicated rhyme schemes, generally speaking, in Romance languages because there's so many vowels and because the rules about what order you put the words in the sentence are a lot looser. And so in English, with the English sonnet, or sometimes called the Shakespearean sonnet, you'll see that there's a lot more rhymes. In a Petrarchan sonnet, you've got 4 rhymes: A, B, C, D, oh, I guess an E. You got 5 rhymes at most. In a Shakespearean sonnet, you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You got 7 different rhymes. And so it's easier to write because you don't have as many tricky rhymes to make. But the Shakespearean sonnet, the rhyme scheme is A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. And so you can see very clearly that this is 3 quatrains and a couplet. And Shakespeare does something a little bit different. We'll talk about this when we get to Shakespeare sonnets. Each of his quatrains is going to be like one sentence. It's going to be one clear thought. And they'll progress in a logical way. And then you're going to have a resolution in the couplet. The couplet it's almost like it's a mini essay where you make 3 points and then you conclude it with some sort of resolving element in the couplet that happens at the end. We call this a Shakespearean sonnet because this is the one Shakespeare used the most when he was writing sonnets. But it actually was invented by a guy named Lord Howard. Ha ha. Yeah, no, not me or my ancestor, I don't think. But I just thought I'd throw that out there. Last one that you should know is what's called a Spenserian sonnet. This guy, Edmund Spenser, we're going to look at his poems immediately. He's going to be the first one we look at in this unit. He wrote essentially an English sonnet or a Shakespearean sonnet, but he made it a little more fancy by including something that's called an interlocking rhyme scheme. You can see, looking at it, A, B, A, B, B, C, B, C, C, D, C, D, E, E, that it's 3 quatrains and a couplet, just like the Shakespearean sonnet is. But this one's kind of fun because the second rhyme of the first quatrain is the first rhyme of the second quatrain. And the second rhyme of the second quatrain is the first rhyme of the third quatrain. That's what it's called, interlocking. It's like the rhymes all connect together and join those units. It's harder to write because it only has 5 rhymes as opposed to 7. But it's pretty cool when you hear it and when you see it done. All right. The other thing that I want to talk about with sonnets before we start moving out to more general terms is that the theme of sonnets, certainly the early sonnets, the ones written by Petrarch and Dante and Spenser, among others, is unrequited love. It's not just that the original sonnets were about love. It's about loving somebody who doesn't love you back or doesn't know you exist. In the case of Petrarch and Dante, the person that they loved did not know they existed. And so they just wrote these love poems with no expectation that the love would ever be returned. So unrequited love, when you love someone who doesn't love you back. Well, in Spenser's case, it's a little bit more nuanced. He loved somebody who actively hated him and rejected his advances whenever he talked to her. And so he had a sort of an even worse case of unrequited love going on in his sonnets. And then Shakespeare starts to break some of the rules. You'll find that Shakespeare writes love sonnets to people he's actually in relationships with, as opposed to writing about somebody he couldn't get. And so you start to see a loosening of rules as time goes on. But unrequited love is definitely a theme here that you want to be aware of. It's also something that shows up in a bunch of Shakespeare plays. Sometimes it's the central theme of a play, but more often there'll be a character who loves somebody and they're absolutely rejected over and over again. And that's an example of unrequited love. All right. So other things to look for in the sonnets as we read them and in the other poems in this unit. Sound devices. We've already dealt with alliteration because we read alliterative verse poetry in Anglo-Saxon times. Alliteration is big during the Renaissance poetry as well. So you should be able to identify alliteration when there's 2 of a kind. I think of it like poker, 2 of a kind, or 3 of a kind, or 2 pair. Like when you see that in a line, you're like, oh, hey, there's alliteration. It's repetition of first consonant sounds. I've given you a good example here. Harris hates hamburgers, right? Can you hear it? Harris hates hamburgers. The trick here is that it can't be vowel sounds. It has to be beginning consonant sounds, because whenever you get into vowel sounds, you're dealing with something called assonance, and we'll talk about that in a second. The next sound device, which is also big in these poems, is consonants. So you can look at beginning sounds and words, and if they're consonant sounds, it's alliteration. You can also look at the other end of the word, the tail end of the word. So the repetition of last consonant sounds is consonants. It's harder to spot because we're trained to look at the beginnings of words and we don't listen as well to the ends of words. But I gave you an example here. It's the same example. I did this on purpose. Harris hates hamburgers. Harris hates hamburgers, right? One thing to keep in mind with sound devices is they are sound devices, which means they have to do with the sounds of words rather than with the spelling of words. So let me give you an example here, just because I can. Oops, it's still underlined. Those fierce darts, right? That would be an example of consonants too, even though it's not spelled the way that it looks clearly like consonants, but those ends with an S sound. That's a silent E, so the last sound of the word is S. Fierce, it's a CE, but the sound it makes is an S. And darts is just a straight S. But you can see that this would be an example of consonants as well, even though it's not spelled in a way that we can see it clearly. Welcome to English. It's a terrible language. But that's a good example. Assonance is a little trickier. It's repetition of vowel sounds. And it doesn't matter where in the words the assonance shows up. It's always assonance if it's vowel sound. So it could be at the beginning of the word. It could be at the end of the word. It doesn't really matter. Again, I gave you an example that has vowel sounds built into it. Harris hates hamburgers. Harris hates hamburgers. Right? Like it's the same vowel sound throughout. But this is even trickier because vowels make a ton of sounds. And sometimes combinations of vowels make a particular sound. Like we'll just play with some words like that have the same vowel sound. Like B. All right, that has a hard E sound. And it's spelled with just an E. Whatever. C has a hard E sound, like the ocean, but it's spelled EA. Trying to think of it. Oh. Happy has a hard E sound, but it's spelled with a Y. So hopefully you're starting to see that this one's a little bit more nuanced, a little bit more complex. And it's, I just came up with another one. B, how do you spell being? That looks wrong. But, you know, whatever. Being, also a hard E sound spelled differently. You know, this is difficult stuff. So you have to say it out loud. And the trick here is that poetry was never meant to be visually seen. It was meant to be heard. That's why poetry is called lyric poetry. It goes back to song lyrics. And actually, it gets its name from a musical instrument called the lyre, which was sort of like an early guitar, right? And so all of these things are meant to be heard, not to be seen. And it's about how the words sound rather than how they're spelled. And so you may have to, in order to get the sound devices and understand the sound devices, you may have to actually say the poems out loud and listen to them with your ears to make those connections. All right, we're getting there. Last couple of things, figurative language. We've talked about figurative language in class before, but I've never devoted time to it in a meaningful way. These are complicated poems. You've got to remember that in the Renaissance, there was no general reading public. The reading public was bigger than it had been before. In the Middle Ages and in the Anglo-Saxon period, the people who were telling stories were storytellers, and the stories were told for the nobility. So they were always about the patrons, the people who were paying for it, and they were told for those people. But in the Renaissance, the people who are writing the poems are doing it in a similar way. The regular public is not reading sonnets. So these sonnets were written for the rich, the ultra-educated rich people by ultra-educated people. And so you end up having a lot of complicated ideas, a lot of complicated language. They weren't writing it for just anybody. And so there's sort of a, how do I want to say this? Understated sort of intellectual snobbery going on in poems like this. They are intentionally intellectually difficult because that's the audience they're written for. And because we're in the Renaissance, when the middle class is starting to develop and all of these merchants and people with money are starting to emulate the behaviors of the rich, they are sort of ostentatiously this way in an attempt to rival the landed nobility and stuff like that. They could, for the first time, indulge in some of these kinds of things. So anyway, enough about that. Figurative language is anything that's not literally happening, right? Lots of people, and one of the things that bothers me, maybe it's a pet peeve of mine now, one of the things that bothers me about figurative language is that we use the word literally now to mean figuratively. Like I see people and they're like, I'm so hungry I could literally eat a horse. And you're like, no, you couldn't. You would explode. A horse is bigger than you are. What you mean is you're so hungry you could figuratively eat a horse, but you're using the word literally somehow to add emphasis to your figurative statement. Figuratively means not true. Literally means it's actually happening. And so figurative language is when we say something that's not true, but we act like it's true, and you're able to sort of use mental gymnastics to make this comparison and see what's going on. An example, a metaphor. We all know metaphors. We've known them since like 9th or 8th grade or whatever. A metaphor is a comparison that does not use like or as. So if I were to say, school is hell, okay, that would be an example of a metaphor. School is not hell. Nobody's stabbing you with pitchforks and setting you on fire. You're not walking on burning sulfur, right? But figuratively, we're like, oh yeah, it's kind of like a punishment. You're stuck there and you got to do these tasks and it feels like torture. So, okay, figuratively, school is hell. Not literally. Another example would be a simile. It's a comparison using like or as. If I were to say school is like hell, it asks you to do a little less mental work. It's a little simpler to understand if I use the word like there, but it does essentially the same thing. That would be an example of a simile. An oxymoron is two contradictory words that are placed together, cold fire, bittersweet. If I were a poet and I said, the look in her eyes as she heads for the door is a cold fire, right? Fire isn't cold. Fire is hot. It burns you. But to say it's a cold fire, fire symbolizes anger, and the idea of being cold is sort of emotionless, and it's contradictory, but I sort of get what's going on here. It's two contradictory words placed together, and they have some sort of effect. Bittersweet. You ever have a bittersweet feeling? Well, which is it, bitter or sweet? You ever have sweet and sour sauce? Which is it, sweet or sour? All of these are examples of oxymorons. Shaq comes on and tries to sell you icy hot. Which is it, Shaq? Is it icy or hot? I don't know. Any of those things would be oxymorons. You just need to be able to spot them. They're generally just used for dramatic effect. There's not some big underlying truth in an oxymoron. On the other hand, paradox is a lot more complicated. So a paradox is an illogical statement that holds some figurative truth. We're going to read a poem. The first sonnet we're going to read actually is centered around a paradox. In the poem, there's a guy who loves a girl, and her feelings for him he likens to ice. She's cold as ice to him, but his feelings for her are like a raging fire. And he reasons that if you put fire next to ice, the ice should melt, so she should soften up towards him. But instead, he puts his fire next to her ice, and she hates him more. So her ice gets harder and bigger. So on some level, this is impossible to say that fire hardens ice, that fire makes ice colder. But on a figurative level, not on a literal level, but on a figurative level, there's some truth to that. This idea that, like if you're passionate for somebody and you profess your love, they may hate you more. That actually can happen. So literally it's not possible, but figuratively it is. And that would be an example of a paradox. But one of my favorite paradoxes from this author, Oscar Wilde, from the Victorian age, he said, there are only two tragedies in life. One is not getting what one wants, and the other is getting it. I have this on my wall in the classroom. But the idea here, and it's very solid, is there's only two tragedies in life, and you're like, okay, I buy that. And then he tells you what they are, and one is not getting what you want, the other's getting it. Does that mean like everything is a tragedy? That doesn't make sense, Oscar Wilde. How is everything in life a tragedy? It can't be true. All right, so it's an illogical or impossible statement, but then you start thinking about it, you're like, wait a minute, this is kind of true, right? Like, it's tragic when you don't get what you want. You wish you got what you wanted. But it's also tragic when you get what you want. And nowhere is this more true than in boyfriends or girlfriends or video games, right? Like, you think it's going to be perfect. You build it up in your mind that it's going to be perfect. You've wanted this thing your entire life. And then when you get it, you discover all the imperfections. It's not perfect. It's not as good as you hoped it would be. It's ironic and it's paradoxical, but sometimes having is not as pleasing as wanting. Because when you want something, it can be perfect in your mind. But when you have it, it never is. Right? And so it ends up being a paradox. And paradoxes generally expose those big central truths or those ideas like the one I was just talking about. Last couple things, because I've been talking for a while and I wanted to get this in under a half an hour, and I think I'm going to make it. Hyperbole is just a fancy word for exaggeration. In sonnets, poets love to exaggerate. I love you for eternity. Your hair is like the golden waterfall, right? Like, these things are not true. They're exaggerations, but we're doing them for dramatic effect. We call it hyperbole. So instead of using the word exaggeration, you be a bit of a literary nerd and use the word hyperbole when you're talking about writing. Finally, personification. You all know this from forever ago. Remember, it's giving human traits or emotions to inanimate objects. The desks stood at attention. The clock, the second hand, walked its slow rounds. Like these things are not actually happening. The moon was sad. Like personification. Finally, and this is really important to poetry, especially to Renaissance poetry, is symbols. When something represents something else. There's all of these symbols. Like, we've been dealing with symbols all year, like the seasons being the human life cycle. That's a standard symbol throughout. Roses representing love is a standard symbol, throughout. And so there's a lot of symbolic language. I just talked about one in that paradox example. My love is like to ice and I to fire. This guy is symbolically equating the girl he loves to ice and himself to fire. I mean, they're representing their feelings. So anytime that you can see the author doing something symbolic, there's probably something more to it, and you can sort of pull it out and look at it. And of course, a lot of our other terms are going to apply, tone and theme and stuff like that. But I really tried to keep this to the important terms to understanding Renaissance poetry, and hopefully it does that. All right, I'm going to shut the video down. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. I am more than happy to answer them. Thanks for your time and attention.